Master Sergeant Donovan Cross's voice cut across the briefing room like a blade hitting concrete. Who authorized a babysitter on Overwatch? 12 Rangers looked up from their maps. Nobody answered. The room smelled like diesel fuel, instant coffee, and 4 days without a proper shower. The particular perfume of a forward operating base in northern Syria, 2017. Cross was standing at the back of the room near the door, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the woman sitting alone at the far corner of the briefing table. She was small, maybe 5'3", lean in the way distance runners were lean, not the kind of lean that came from a gym. Brown hair pulled back through the strap of a faded cap, worn cargo pants, a tan hoodie with a small tear at the left elbow. She was reading something in a battered notebook, not looking up. She looked like someone who had wandered in from a university campus and forgotten to leave. Cross stepped forward. "I'm talking to you, in the corner." She looked up then. Her eyes were the color of winter lake water. Gray, flat, unreadable. She didn't blink. "Staff Sergeant Voss," she said. "Overwatch element." Cross let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "Overwatch." He turned to the room, making sure everyone was watching, making sure the moment landed. "They sent us a babysitter for Overwatch. Rangers moving through Raqqa, 60 men, and command decides what we need is..." He gestured at her with his chin. "That." A few of the younger Rangers shifted uncomfortably. The older ones kept their faces neutral. Mara Voss looked at Cross for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back down at her notebook. What Donovan Cross didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the woman in the corner had more confirmed long-range kills than anyone currently serving in the United States Army. What he didn't know was that her file had 3 pages of visible information and 47 pages marked classified. What he didn't know was that she had spent the last 58 hours lying completely still in the rubble of a bombed-out apartment building 400 meters from the edge of the city, mapping every ISIS position in a 6-block radius, and she had already identified something that was going to get every single man in that room killed. She just hadn't decided yet whether to tell them. Before we go any further, if you want to see how this story ends, hit that subscribe button right now and stay until the very last word. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because what happens next is something I've never told before. And trust me, you are not going to believe what she did in those 9 minutes. To anyone watching her walk across the fob that afternoon, Mara Voss was unremarkable. She was 31 years old, born in Stuttgart, Germany, to a German father and an American mother. She'd moved to Virginia at age 14 when her mother remarried, learned English in 7 months by sheer stubbornness, and enlisted at 18 with the kind of quiet, unannounced certainty that made recruiters nervous. Because the ones who came in quietly were always the ones who stayed longest. She stood 5'3" in boots, 126 pounds. She had the kind of face that didn't register in a crowd. Not plain, not striking, just forgettable in exactly the way a professional sniper needed to be forgettable. Her hands were the only unusual thing about her. They were very still, not the stillness of someone who had learned to control their nerves, the stillness of someone who had been born without the usual quota of restlessness. Master Sergeant Donovan Cross was a different kind of soldier entirely. He was 42 years old, 6'2", built like a man who had been in the Army for so long, his body had simply become the Army. 14 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 tours in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan, Distinguished Marksman Badge, Expert Infantryman Badge, a Combat Infantryman Badge he'd earned the hard way in Fallujah in 2004 when he was 29 years old and thought he was invincible. He had the credentials that made younger Rangers look at him with something close to awe, and he knew it, and he had learned to use it the way other men use rank. His flaw was invisible to him, the way flaws always are to the people who carry them. He had never served beside a woman in a combat role, not once in 14 years, and so he had constructed, carefully and without ever examining it, a complete theory of what women in combat roles were, a political decision imposed from above, a liability disguised as progress, a thing that made him tired just thinking about. He was very good at his job. He was completely wrong about this. The briefing that afternoon was about a man named Faris al-Masri. Al-Masri was 44 years old, Syrian born, and had spent the previous decade making himself indispensable to the Islamic State's logistics network in northeastern Syria. He wasn't a fighter. He'd never fired a weapon at an American soldier, not directly. What he did was move money, move weapons, move people. He coordinated the supply lines that kept 3 separate ISIS cells operational in and around Raqqa, and according to the intelligence that had landed on the FOB commander's desk 6 days ago, he was currently in a specific building in a specific neighborhood in the eastern part of the city. The mission was straightforward on paper. A ranger element, 60 men, would move through the city to secure the building and extract al-Masri for interrogation. Clean, fast, professional. The kind of operation the Rangers had done dozens of times. What made it complicated was Mara Voss. She had been inserted into that bombed-out apartment building 58 hours before the briefing, alone except for her spotter, Corporal Marco Rivera, 24 years old, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had the patience of a man twice his age and the fastest range calculations she'd ever seen on a human being. They had been 2 ghosts in the rubble, still and silent and invisible, watching. And Mara had seen something that changed the entire geometry of the mission. She had spotted the first one on hour 12, a figure on a rooftop 420 meters to the northeast, in a building that overlooked the main approach route the Rangers would use. He was good, well camouflaged, disciplined, barely moving, but she'd been watching that rooftop for 6 hours, and she noticed the way the shadows shifted in a way shadows didn't shift on their own. A spotter, armed with a radio, positioned to direct fire. She marked it in her notebook without a word. By hour 24, she had found 2 more, one tucked into the upper floor of a collapsed building to the west, watching a secondary approach, one on a water tower she'd almost dismissed as structural damage until she saw the antenna wire running down the back. By hour 40, she had identified all 5. Not random fighters, not teenagers with Kalashnikovs playing at war. These were trained spotters with overlapping fields of observation, positioned to provide advance warning and fire direction the moment the Rangers entered the kill zone. Their coverage was surgical. They watched every approach route the Ranger element might realistically use. There was no angle from which 60 soldiers could enter that neighborhood without being seen. It was a perfectly designed early warning network. And the worst part, they weren't positioned to fight. They were positioned to call in the fighters waiting inside the buildings, who outnumbered the Rangers 3-1. Rivera had whispered to her, his lips barely moving, "They knew we were coming." "Yes," she'd said. "Someone told them." "Yes." "What do we do?" She hadn't answered, because she didn't have one yet. She'd lain there in the dust, in the broken concrete, and stared through her scope and thought, and let her mind do what it did when she gave it room, move through the problem the way water moved through rock, finding every crack, every path, every possibility. By hour 52, she had a plan. It was insane. It was the only option. And when she brought it to Cross in the briefing room, she already knew he wasn't going to hear it. Not from her. Not from the babysitter in the corner. Her father's name was Heinrich Voss. He had served 22 years in the Bundeswehr, the German army, as a sniper, and later as a marksmanship instructor. He was the kind of man who was constitutionally incapable of explaining things he loved. He simply did them, and you watched, and eventually you understood. He had the patience of someone for whom patience had never been a discipline but a default condition. The way some people were simply taller than others, or simply better at languages. He waited for things the way mountains waited for weather. He had taught Mara to shoot when she was 11, not because he had planned to, but because she asked, and he never knew how to say no to her when she was genuinely curious. He'd placed her behind a bolt action .22 on a range outside Stuttgart on a Saturday morning in November, adjusted her grip, adjusted her cheek well, and said nothing else for 20 minutes while she fired 30 rounds into a paper target at 50 meters. The first group was scattered across 12 inches of paper. By the last group, she was hitting inside 3 inches without being told how. He hadn't praised her. He'd simply said, gut, again next week. That was how he taught. He showed you what to look at and then left you alone with it, which was both the most respectful and the most effective teaching method she had ever encountered. He was dead by the time she was 19. A training accident on a live fire range in Bavaria, the kind of accident that happened to men who had survived real war and then let their guard down in peacetime because the mind needed somewhere to put all that hypervigilance, and sometimes it put it in the wrong drawer. The investigation concluded it was equipment failure. She had read the investigation report 3 times, over 3 years, and each time she'd come away believing that the equipment had failed, and also that something else had failed first, something internal, the particular kind of exhaustion that accumulated so slowly in men of her father's type that neither they nor the people who loved them ever saw it coming. She didn't talk about him. She didn't carry a photograph. She didn't need to. She carried something better, the single piece of instruction he had given her that she had never been able to improve on. No matter how many years she'd spent trying, no matter how many qualified people had tried to improve on it with their own versions. He told her on a cold October morning on a range outside Stuttgart when she was 13 years old and frustrated because she kept pulling left at the moment of trigger break. She'd fired 40 rounds into a target and every single one had drifted left by the same fraction. Not random, not inconsistent, but precisely wrong in precisely the same way, which told her it was something she was doing and not something the rifle was doing. And she knew it, and she couldn't find it, and she was angry in the controlled way her father had also been angry, which was very still on the outside and loud on the inside. He'd watched her fire the 41st round. Then he'd walked up behind her and crouched down so his face was level with hers. He said, "Du schießt nicht auf das Ziel. Du wirst dir stilles Wischen den Hirschlagen." You don't shoot the target. You become the stillness between heartbeats. She'd said, at 13, "Das ergibt keinen Sinn." That doesn't make sense. He'd said, "Shoot again." She'd shot. The round hit dead center. She had no idea why. She still didn't completely, but she'd spent the intervening 18 years shooting and thinking and coming closer by increments to understanding what he'd meant. The closest she'd gotten was this. There was a difference between controlling your body through an act of will and allowing your body to be what it already knew how to be. Will was active, contracting, effortful, and effort in the final tenth of a second before trigger break was the enemy of accuracy. You had to let go of trying and simply be the thing you'd practiced being 10,000 times until it was no longer something you did, but something you were. She thought about that sentence nearly every day for 18 years. She still wasn't sure she fully understood it, but she'd learned to live inside it, which was probably what he'd intended. The thing Donovan Cross didn't know, couldn't have known from a 10-second visual assessment, was Mara Voss's service record. She had enlisted at 18. She had qualified as a sniper at 20, which was not unusual. What was unusual was her qualification score, 98.7 out of a possible 100, the third highest score recorded at the qualification course in 14 years. The rangemaster had pulled her aside afterward and said, with the economy of a man who did not give compliments, "I've been doing this for 19 years. I've seen two people shoot like that. Both of them were men, and both of them are now instructors." He'd paused. "I don't know what to do with you." The Army had eventually figured out what to do with her. It had sent her places and given her assignments that did not appear in the visible portions of her service record. She had served alongside special operations elements in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in one country whose name she would not say in any room without a classified designation. She had, at one point, been the designated overwatch for an operation involving personnel whose existence the United States government would have denied if asked directly. She had made shots that were never officially documented because the documentation would have required acknowledging that the shots had happened, and acknowledging that the shots had happened would have required acknowledging the operations. And some operations existed in a space where acknowledgement was a security liability rather than a matter of honesty. She had 94 confirmed kills at distances ranging from 180 meters to a number she was not permitted to disclose. 31 of them were at ranges exceeding 700 meters. She was 31 years old, and she looked like someone who had wandered in from a university campus. She had found, over the years, that this was useful. After the briefing, she found Cross near the vehicle bay, going over the route map with his team leaders. "Sergeant Cross," she said. He looked up. The expression on his face was the particular expression of a man who has decided, before a conversation begins, that it will not produce anything useful. "Voss, I need 5 minutes. I've got 4. She laid her notebook on the hood of the nearest vehicle. She had sketched the positions of all 5 spotters on a rough map of the neighborhood, with their estimated fields of observation marked in overlapping arcs. It was clean, precise work, the kind of sketch that communicated exactly what it needed to and nothing extra. Cross looked at it. He didn't say anything. 5 spotters, she said, all confirmed over the last 48 hours. Overlapping observation coverage on every approach route to the target building. The moment your element enters the neighborhood, all 5 transmit. You'll have fighters in the streets before your lead squad reaches the 3rd block." Cross studied the sketch for a long moment. She watched his face and saw the thing that happened when competent men received information that contradicted their existing plan. The brief flicker, the recalculation, and then the hardening. "How confident are you in these positions?" "I've had eyes on all 5 for between 18 and 46 hours. The positions are confirmed." "How confident are you in the intent?" "They might just be, they're in direct radio communication with each other. I've observed the antenna on the water tower transmit 4 times in the last 12 hours. Each time, there was movement in the building to the southeast within 6 minutes." She paused. "They're not watching for us to be curious. They're watching for us to coordinate a response." Cross straightened. He handed her back the notebook. "I'll pass the intel up to command. The operation is in 14 hours. I know when the operation is, Staff Sergeant." She held his gaze. If the spotters are in position when your element moves, you're going to lose people in the first 2 minutes. The approach doesn't have sufficient concealment pass. I said I'll pass it up. He turned back to the map. Thank you for your report. She stood there for 1 beat longer than was comfortable. Then she picked up her notebook and walked away. Behind her, she heard one of the younger rangers. She'd learned later his name was Specialist Kowalski, 22 years old, on his second deployment, asked Cross quietly, "Is she right about the spotters?" Cross was quiet for a moment. She might be right about the positions. Doesn't mean she's right about the response. What's the response if she's right? Cross didn't answer that. She heard him fold the map. She heard one of the other team leaders, Sergeant First Class Webb, 14 years in, voice like gravel, say, "I've seen her type before. Analyst. They're good at spotting patterns, but pattern recognition isn't the same as ground truth. We'll run the route and we'll adapt." She kept walking. She didn't look back. She had spent 12 years being the person in the room who was right and not being heard. And she had learned, slowly at cost, through specific failures she carried in specific ways, that there were only 2 responses available to her when that happened. She could expend her energy on the argument, or she could expend it on finding another way to solve the problem. She had tried both. The second approach worked more consistently. There was one more person she hadn't tried. She found the FOB commander, Major Collins, at the operations center. He was a lean man of 45 who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned long ago that urgency and efficiency were not the same thing. He was reviewing drone footage with a junior intelligence officer when she knocked on the open door. "Staff Sergeant Voss," he said. "Come in, close it." She did. She laid the notebook on his desk. She gave him the same briefing she'd given Cross, but shorter. 3 minutes, not 5, because she'd refined it and because compression made the core information clearer. She was conscious, as she spoke, of not editorializing, not Cross dismissed this, just the information, the timeline, the positions, the risk. Collins studied the sketch. He asked 2 questions, the first about the transmission intervals, the second about the southeast building she'd identified as the likely fighter staging point. Then he was quiet for 60 seconds. She counted. "I'll call Patterson," he said finally. That was the operations officer, the lieutenant colonel with the timeline he couldn't move. "He won't change the timeline," she said. "Probably not, but I can get him to authorize a modified overwatch protocol if the tactical picture supports it." He looked at her directly. "What do you need?" 9 minutes before the Ranger element enters the grid. Give me 9 minutes and I'll clear the approach." Collins looked at her for a long moment. He had the specific quality of attention that distinguished good senior officers from adequate ones. He was actually looking at her, not at the idea of her, not at the category she occupied in his mental filing system. He was looking at the person in front of him and making a judgment about that specific person. "What's your confidence level on clearing all 5 in 9 minutes?" "High," she said. "With a rifle jam or a position change on one of the targets, still viable. With 2 significant complications simultaneously, we adjust and do what we can. And if you can't clear all 5, then we know where 4 of them are, and the Rangers deal with 1 unknown, which is better than 5 unknowns." Another pause. She let it stand. She had learned that filling silences was usually the wrong move. "I'll see what Patterson will give me," Collins said. "Get your kit ready." Patterson gave her 7 minutes. Collins negotiated him up to 9. She found Rivera at the edge of the motor pool, eating an MRE with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that nutrition was logistics. "They're not changing the plan," she said. Rivera looked up. He had a young face, The kind of face that looked younger with stubble than without it, and eyes that were very dark and very calm. He'd been her spotter for 14 months. She trusted him the way you trusted a part of your own body, not because she'd decided to, but because 14 months of lying motionless in dangerous places together had made the trust automatic. Command said no. Cross said he'd pass it up, which means no. Rivera set down the MRE. So, what do we do? Mara sat down against the vehicle behind her and stared at the darkening Syrian sky. The sun was going down in layers, orange at the horizon, deep blue above, the first stars appearing in the east. It was almost beautiful, this destroyed country, in the particular way that destroyed things sometimes were. I count the spotters' positions again, she said. I time their patterns. I figure out if there's a sequence. And if there is, she was quiet for a moment. Her hands were very still in her lap. Then I talk to command and propose an alternative overwatch protocol. And if they say no again, she looked at him. Then we improvise. Rivera nodded slowly. He'd learned in 14 months that when Mara Voss said, "We improvise," she had already finished improvising in her head and was simply waiting for permission to execute. Command said, no, not Cross. He'd apparently passed the intel up faithfully enough. It was the operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Patterson, who was coordinating from 50 miles away and who had a timeline from higher that he couldn't move. The intelligence on Al-Masri's location had a shelf life. Every hour they waited was an hour Al-Masri might move. The operation went forward at 0200 as planned. Mara was given a modified tasking. She and Rivera would position on a rooftop 380 meters from the target building and provide overwatch for the Ranger element. Standard mission: cover from above, call out threats, direct fire as needed. She acknowledged the order. Then she lay awake until midnight doing math in her head. 5 spotters, overlapping positions. If she could identify the communication sequence, the order in which they transmitted, she could potentially work backward from the last to the first. If she could take them down fast enough, in the right order, before any one of them transmitted a contact report, 9 minutes. She ran the numbers 3 times, from 3 different angles, accounting for wind, distance, angle of engagement, and the time it would take to reposition between shots. Every time she ran them, she got 9 minutes. 9 minutes to take down 5 trained spotters across 5 different positions at varying distances, without any of them transmitting a warning that would bring fighters into the streets before the Rangers arrived. It was insane. It was mathematically possible. It was the only option she could find. She went to find Cross at 2300. He was outside the operations building, alone, going over the route one more time on a laminated map. There was something almost admirable about it. The man prepared. She would give him that. Sergeant Cross, he looked up. He was tired. Something in the set of his face had shifted since the afternoon. Some of the performance had gone out of it, and what was left was just a very experienced soldier who was not entirely happy with the plan he was executing. Voss, what time is it? 2300. We move in 3 hours. I know. She paused. I want to propose an adjusted overwatch protocol. He straightened. Command approved I know what command approved. I'm proposing something different. She opened her notebook. I've been timing the spotters' transmission patterns for the last 6 hours. They're operating on a rotating check-in cycle. Each position transmits in sequence, roughly every 22 minutes. The cycle starts at position 5, the water tower, and runs northeast to southwest. She turned the notebook toward him so he could see the timeline she'd drawn. If I engage them in reverse sequence, southwest to northeast, I can potentially work against the transmission cycle. Take each one before their check-in window opens. Cross stared at the timeline. She watched him doing the math. How long? He said finally. 9 minutes, from first shot to last. He looked up at her. 5 targets, different positions, different distances, different angles. Yes. In 9 minutes, yes. He was quiet for a long time. She could see him fighting it, the logic against the resistance, the information against the bias. He was a smart man. That was the thing about smart men with blind spots. The intelligence made them argue better, but it couldn't make them see. You're asking me to trust the entire operation to... I'm not asking you to trust anything, she said. I'm asking you to give me 9 minutes before your element enters the grid. If the spotters are still active, your element takes no additional risk. The plan doesn't change. If I clear them, your element moves into a clean zone. She closed the notebook. The downside of giving me 9 minutes is 9 minutes. The downside of not giving me 9 minutes is 60 men walking into a kill zone. A long silence. Cross's jaw was tight. His eyes were on the map. Rivera goes with you, he said finally. You clear the spotters or you don't, but you don't expose yourself without a spotter. Understood? If you miss, if you're wrong about the sequence, if a single one of them transmits before you finish, then we're in the same situation we'd have been in without this. No worse. He picked up the map. He folded it with the precise movements of someone who needed to do something with their hands. 9 minutes, he said, not 9 minutes and 1 second. They were in position by 0145. The rooftop was the 3rd floor of a collapsed residential building. Half the floor still intact, the outer wall reduced to rubble that gave them excellent concealment and a clear line of sight across the grid. It smelled like ash, an old mortar, and something chemical she didn't want to identify. The night was cold in the way Syrian desert nights were cold, without mercy, without warning, arriving like a verdict. Mara settled in behind her rifle. The weapon was an M2010 enhanced sniper rifle, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, not her preferred configuration, but the one available and appropriate for the distances she'd be working. She had zeroed it that afternoon in the 20 minutes between the second command briefing and sunset, firing 5 rounds into a half-inch group at 400 meters, which was sufficient. Rivera was 18 inches to her left, his spotting scope already up, his timer ready on his wrist. The city was quiet in the particular way cities were quiet at 0145. Not actually quiet, just reduced to its baseline hum of generators, distant engines, the occasional bark of a dog somewhere to the east. She glassed each of the 5 positions one final time. All 5 spotters were in place. She keyed her radio. Her voice was level. Overwatch to Ranger 6, we are in position. Request confirmation of 0200 push. Cross's voice came back. Ranger 6 copies. 0200 push confirmed. You have 9 minutes from my mark. Standing by. A pause. Then, mark. 9 minutes. Clock is running. Rivera pressed his timer. Marked 8:59. Mara's heartbeat dropped. It happened automatically, the way a race car downshifted on a straight. Not effort, just physics. Heart rate, 52 beats per minute. Breathing, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The pattern her father had taught her when she was 13 years old on a coal range outside Stuttgart. The world narrowed. Target 1, position southwest. The building with the collapsed upper floor, 290 meters. Spotter tucked into a window gap, partially concealed behind a section of fallen concrete. He had a radio in his right hand. He'd been consistent in his check-in pattern. Last transmission 19 minutes ago. His window would open in approximately 3 minutes. She had to take him before it did. Wind, left to right, approximately 4 knots, gusting to 6 at the building face. Elevation differential. She was slightly above his position, approximately 12 feet. Standard Coriolis negligible at this distance. She adjusted 0.8 MOA right, a fraction of a turn on the windage dial. Her crosshair settled on the center of the shadow just above the fallen concrete. She breathed out. The rifle fired. The spotter dropped without a sound she could hear at this distance. He simply stopped being a vertical presence and became a horizontal one. Rivera didn't react. He was already calling the next target. 843, target 2, water tower, 350 meters, antenna side. Target 2, the water tower, 347 meters. Actually, she'd measured it twice from her observation post. The spotter was behind the tower structure, mostly concealed, with only the antenna wire and occasional glimpses of movement visible. She'd been watching this one longest. She knew his pattern. Every 6 minutes, he moved from the concealed position to the antenna and transmitted, then moved back. He transmitted 11 minutes ago. He was due. She needed to catch him before he reached the antenna. She shifted 34 degrees right. Different range, different elevation. The crosshair found the gap between the tower structure and the water tank above, the only angle through which his body would be partially visible when he moved. She waited. 3 seconds. 5. 7. He moved. The instant the edge of his shoulder appeared in her reticle, she pressed the trigger. The figure jerked sideways and went down behind the tower base. Not clean. She couldn't tell if the shot was immediately effective. She watched for 2 full seconds. He didn't get up. He didn't transmit. 831, Rivera said. Target 3, northeast rooftop, 410 meters. He's moved since last observation. New position approximately 1 meter south of the chimney structure. She found him. The shift was small but meaningful. The chimney now gave him slightly more cover than she'd planned for. The angle she'd calculated was no longer viable. She needed to compensate. Her father's voice, clear and German and completely unperturbed by the situation. Du wirst die. Stilles Wissen den Herschlagen. She let the breath go out slow, found the new angle. The gap between the chimney and the parapet wall was narrow, maybe 8 inches of visible target at this distance. She was aiming for something the size of a hardcover book at 400 meters in the dark. She breathed out. The crosshair was steady. She pressed the trigger. A hit. The figure folded behind the parapet and was still. 814, Rivera said. Target 4. The bolt didn't cycle. She felt it before she heard it. The mechanical resistance that meant something had gone wrong inside the receiver. She worked the handle. It moved partway and stopped. A case failure. The spent brass hadn't ejected cleanly. She'd had it happen before. Twice in 4 years. Once in Afghanistan in 2013, where the round had been slightly overpressured due to heat, and once on a training range in Virginia, where she'd been using ammunition from a batch that later got recalled. Both times, she'd cleared it in under 10 seconds. Both times, she'd had the leisure of no one's life, depending on the next 8 seconds. This was not those times. Her heart rate spiked, 68 beats per minute, still manageable. She locked down the part of her brain that wanted to react, the part that was already calculating how many seconds she'd lost, what this meant for the 5th spotter's transmission window, whether the whole plan was unraveling. She handed control to the part that only knew how to solve problems 1 step at a time. Step 1, charging handle. She gripped it and worked it back with precise, controlled force. The case was stuck, partially extracted, but not clear. She felt the friction and applied steady pressure rather than jerking it, because jerking could seat the case further or damage the extractor, and either outcome would turn a manageable malfunction into an unusable weapon. The case came free with a sound she felt more than heard. She swept it clear with the side of her hand. Step 2, chamber check. She rotated the bolt slightly, confirmed the chamber was clear, locked it forward, seated the next round. Step 3, return to position. She was back behind the scope before Rivera finished saying 7:59, 8 seconds lost, 1 second less than both previous malfunctions. The time she spent managing the adrenaline was apparently getting shorter. Target 4, Southern Approach Building, 370 meters. He's alert. I think the echo off the wall from shot 3 may have carried. I see him. He had moved. Not because he'd heard the suppressed shots. At this range, suppressed, the report was a faint mechanical click that dissolved into ambient noise before it reached his position. But something had reached him. Experience, instinct, the particular animal alertness that kept trained men alive in environments where other men died. He was no longer in his original window. He was moving laterally along the interior of the building's upper floor, visible only in fragments through the series of window gaps as he crossed from one room to the next. A moving target, 370 meters, multiple windows, each giving her a half-second glimpse as he passed through. The windows were irregularly spaced. The building's interior walls hadn't been placed with any concern for her convenience. She could see him in window 1 for approximately 0.4 of a second, then 3 feet of wall, then window 2 for roughly 0.6, a longer gap this time because the room was wider, then 2 feet of wall, then a third window. She needed to be waiting at the third window before he arrived at it. She calculated his pace. He was moving at a controlled walk, not a run, which meant he was alert but not panicked, which meant he was a professional, which meant he was going to stop at the next covered position and reassess rather than keep moving. If he stopped in the third room before reaching window 3, she had nothing. She would lose him and he would transmit. She led him by 3/4 of a body length and already had her finger on the trigger when he crossed into window 3. She pressed. The movement stopped. He went down inside the room, out of sight, but the movement stopped away. Movement only stopped when the nervous system lost its direction. 7:38, Rivera said, and she heard the exhale he was trying to suppress. 4 down, 1 remaining. She was already shifting. Northeast position, 465 meters. He's the smart one, Rivera said quietly. He's gone completely still. I don't have an angle on anything. She found the 5th position and stared at it. Rivera was understating the problem. The 5th spotter hadn't just gone still. He had gone invisible. She'd known his original position from hours of observation, behind a low sandbag wall he'd built or found at the northeast corner of a rooftop, with his body fully concealed behind it and only the radio antenna extending upward. From her current angle, she had 0 visible target, not partial, 0. There was nothing to aim at except the antenna, and shooting the antenna would confirm her position without eliminating the threat. He was smart enough to understand what was happening. 4 of his 5 colleagues had gone silent in the last 90 seconds. He didn't know why. He couldn't have identified the shots, couldn't have heard them, probably couldn't even see the positions from where he was. But he had a radio, and his radio had gone quiet in a way that radios didn't go quiet randomly, and he was smart enough to respond to that information by doing exactly the most dangerous possible thing, nothing. He was waiting for her to make a mistake. His check-in window had opened 40 seconds ago. he hadn't transmitted. Either he understood that transmitting would locate him, or he was waiting to understand the situation better before he sent his alert. Either way, the window was open. Every second he stayed silent was a second he might choose to break that silence. She had 7 minutes and 38 seconds on the clock, and she had no shot. "Rivera," she said, "I'm going to bait him. 3 shots, wrong angles. I need you to watch his position and call any movement, any fraction." Understood. The problem with baiting a trained spotter was that they were trained to resist exactly that impulse. The impulse to respond to unexpected fire by moving to get an angle on the source. A raw fighter, someone with less experience, would move toward the sound or away from it or do something involuntary. A trained man would recognize the bait and stay put. She needed to make him uncertain enough that his discipline cracked, not enough to make him transmit. That was the line she couldn't cross, but enough to make his body override his training for a fraction of a second. She shifted her rifle 40 degrees left of his position, fired a single round into the wall of an unoccupied building 30 meters to his west. The impact kicked up dust and plaster, visible at his position, audible at his position, clearly originating from a location that was not where she actually was. She watched the sandbag wall through her scope. Nothing. Good discipline. She'd expected it. She fired again. This time, closer. 15 meters west. Chips of concrete jumping from the wall at the building's base. Closer to him. A suggestion that she was moving, that her position was changing, that the threat was shifting. Still nothing. 6 minutes 40, Rivera said. His voice was level, but she could hear the effort it was taking to keep it level. She fired a third round, this time completely wrong. High east, a shot that zinged off a stone cornice 60 meters in the opposite direction from his position. Chaotic, confused. A shooter who didn't know where her target was. For 3 seconds, the rooftop was still. Then, movement, Rivera said. His left shoulder. He's adjusting his position. Maybe 2 inches right, trying to get an angle on where. 2 inches right. The left side of his face, the curve of his cheek above the sandbag, appeared in her reticle. 3 inches of exposed target at 465 meters in ambient urban light. She put the crosshair on the highest point of what she could see and pressed the trigger without running a full cycle, without the full exhale, without the full routine, because there wasn't time, and because the math was done, and because her father was right 18 years ago on a coal range outside Stuttgart, and she understood it now the way she understood it best, which was by doing it. The 5th spotter went down and did not move. 5:49, Rivera said. A pause. 5 spotters. All clear. Mara's heart rate was at 76. She forced it down through 4 full breath cycles. She keyed the radio. Ranger 6, overwatch. All 5 spotters eliminated. Approach routes are clear. You are good to move. Silence for 2 seconds. Then Cross's voice, stripped of everything except professionalism. Overwatch. Ranger 6 copies. Moving now. A pause she couldn't read. Excellent work. She didn't respond. She was already scanning the grid for secondary threats, already looking for anything else that might compromise the movement of 60 Rangers through the streets below. There were 12 things that could still go wrong. She started checking them. The Rangers moved beautifully, even from 380 meters. In the dark, through a rifle scope, she could appreciate the professionalism of it. 60 men flowing through the urban terrain in coordinated elements, using every shadow and doorway and vehicle, covering each other's movement with practiced invisibility. Cross had his team leaders working well. She called out 2 fighters who appeared briefly in upper floor windows as the lead element passed, both of whom were neutralized before they could engage. By 0224, the Ranger element had reached the outer perimeter of the target building. By 0231, they had breached. She heard the controlled chaos of the assault on the radio. Brief transmissions, grid references, room clearing confirmations. She kept scanning, kept watching the surrounding buildings for reaction forces, for fighters moving toward the sound of the assault. She found 3 groups attempting to approach from different directions and provided accurate fire control information that allowed the Ranger support elements to engage before any of the groups could reach the building. 2 of the groups broke and scattered. The third pulled back to a position she couldn't cover from her rooftop. At 0247, she heard Cross's voice on the radio. Ranger 6, building secure. Target is... A burst of static. Then, Overwatch, Ranger 6, target is not in the building. I say again, Al-Masri is not in the building. Her stomach dropped. She knew what that meant. She'd been afraid of it. A source with access to their operational planning had warned Al-Masri in time for him to move. The building had been a staging site, not a residence. There were documents, equipment, intelligence value, but not the target himself. She was about to respond when Rivera grabbed her sleeve. Mara, his voice had a quality she didn't like. She turned. He was looking to the southeast, at a building she'd been watching intermittently all night. A 3-story structure that she'd cleared as vacant because there was no visible movement, no lights, no thermal signatures. Movement, 3rd floor, someone just there. The window. She swung her scope to it. A figure, moving fast, purposeful, toward a window that overlooked the building where the Rangers were working, carrying what appeared to be a radio and something else. She couldn't make it out at first, and then she could. A rifle, not a spotter, a shooter. Ranger 6, Overwatch. I have a shooter in position, 3-story building, southeast of your location, approximately 220 meters. He's elevating toward your position. Copy, Overwatch. Can you engage? She was already calculating. The angle was awkward. She was almost directly to the west of the building, which meant she was shooting across the face of the window rather than into it. The shooter was behind the window frame. She had maybe 6 inches of visible target. I have a partial angle. Stand by. She breathed. The crosshair moved. She tracked the shooter as he raised his weapon and settled it on the windowsill, the barrel extending outward, angling down toward the Rangers below. His finger was going to move in the next 2 seconds. She pressed the trigger. The shot hit the window frame, and she saw the shooter jerk backward and go down. She couldn't confirm, too much obstruction, but the rifle dropped off the windowsill and the barrel she'd been watching disappeared. 30 seconds of silence. Then, from below, Overwatch Ranger 6, we're good. That was close. Copy, she said. Rivera was already back on his scope, scanning. 2 blocks east, vehicle, moving fast. She found it. A truck, moving without headlights, coming toward the perimeter. The profile was wrong. Too fast, too purposeful. Not civilian traffic at 0300. Ranger 6, vehicle approaching from the east, no lights, moving fast. Assess as hostile. Recommend an explosion. Not the truck. Something inside the building the Rangers were clearing. A secondary device. She heard the blast and felt the pressure wave even at 380 meters and saw the flash through a 1st floor window. Ranger 6, report. We're up. Cross's voice, harder and faster than before. 3 casualties, minor. We need to move. Can you cover the eastern approach? Affirm. The vehicle, I see it. Cover us. She fired twice at the vehicle. Both rounds hit the front end. The truck swerved and stopped, the driver apparently injured. From the truck bed, fighters began dismounting and taking cover. 4 fighters, armed, moving toward the building. She worked methodically. First shot, first fighter. He went down behind a parked car and didn't move. Second shot, she missed. The target had moved faster than she'd anticipated. Third shot, a hit. 2 fighters left, both in cover, both aware now of her position. Rivera said, "They're going to flank us." The 2 remaining, "They're moving to the north, trying to find an angle on this building." "How much time do we have?" 1 minute, maybe. Ranger 6, overwatch. We have 2 fighters attempting to flank our position. We may need to displace. Copy. Can you hold 2 more minutes? She looked at Rivera. He looked back at her. 2 minutes was a long time when someone was trying to get an angle on you. "We'll hold," she said. She fired a suppressing round toward where she'd last seen the first flanker, keeping their head down. Rivera shifted to the secondary scope and found the second flanker. "He's almost at the corner," Rivera said. 10 seconds. Location? North wall of the building to our left, ground level. He's going to come around the corner and he'll have an angle on our position. She pivoted 90 degrees, completely abandoning her primary line of sight. The flanker came around the corner at a run. She fired once, he went down. The second flanker broke and ran. "Ranger 6, overwatch. We've neutralized the flanking element. How much longer?" 1 minute. We're X-filing now. Start moving toward the extraction point. We'll cover you from the street. She and Rivera began breaking down their position. Not a full breakdown, just the essential movements. Rifle cleared, critical equipment secured, anything that would identify them left behind. They moved to the roof access door and down the stairs into the building's ground floor. That was when she heard the radio. Not her radio, a radio somewhere in the building. She'd cleared the building before taking the position. She was certain of it. She'd been certain of it. The transmission was in Arabic, short, urgent. Rivera looked at her. She held up one hand. Still. The sound had come from above. A second floor she'd assessed as structurally compromised and empty. She'd been wrong about the structural compromise. The floor was intact. She may have been wrong about the empty. She signaled to Rivera, "Cover the stairs." She moved toward the ground floor interior, toward the space below the second floor, and listened. Nothing. The transmission had stopped. Then footsteps, very light, moving toward the staircase. She moved to a position covering the bottom of the stairs, her rifle up, and waited. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Small, male, young, maybe 18, wearing civilian clothes, carrying a radio and a handgun. He saw her and froze. "Drop it," she said, in Arabic, which she'd learned to a functional conversational level over 2 deployments and 300 hours of language training. "Drop it, hands up, don't move, sit down." These she could say with certainty. He dropped the radio, not the handgun. "The handgun," she said, "put it down." He was scared. She could see it in the way he was breathing. Not a trained fighter, someone's nephew, someone's son, given a radio and a gun and told to watch a building and report. "Put it down," she said again. "No one has to get hurt." The handgun clattered to the floor. He put his hands up. She zip-tied him to a support column with materials from her kit and moved back to Rivera. "Clear," she said. "We move now." They X-filed through the eastern side of the building, moving toward the Ranger extraction point 4 blocks north. Cross's element was already in the street, moving in disciplined formation, casualties being assisted by teammates. She found Cross at the head of the formation. 6 spotters, he said, not looking at her. His eyes were on the street ahead. "I thought you said 5. "I thought there were 5. The 6th was in my building. staying in place to report when we left. And he's zip-tied to a column on the second floor. He's 18 maybe, not a fighter. She paused. Someone should go back for him. Cross was quiet for a moment. I'll call it in, he said. They were at the extraction point at 0318. Helicopters came in at 0326. 2 Black Hawks, rotors beating the Syria night, flaring hard over the street. The Rangers loaded fast, organized, professional. She climbed aboard the second aircraft and felt the familiar sensation of wheels off. That particular letting go that came when the ground stopped being your problem and the air became your domain instead. She was watching the city fall away beneath them when Rivera said, from the seat beside her, "Mara." She turned. Al-Masri. He was pointing east. Below, in the city, a figure moving fast across a rooftop. She almost didn't catch it. He was clever with his concealment, staying close to walls, moving only when the helicopter's angle made direct observation difficult. But she caught him. He was crossing toward the roof edge, toward a fire escape or staircase that would take him down and into the streets and into a vehicle and away. He was moving at speed. In 30 seconds, he'd be off the roof. She could see his face in the ambient light. It matched the photograph she had memorized. Faris al-Masri, the coordinator, the man whose network had kept 3 ISIS cells operational for 2 years. The reason 60 Rangers had come to Raqqa in the middle of the night. He was right there. And the helicopter was moving, banking north, putting distance between them every second. The range was already 870 meters and increasing. Rivera said, "Mara, that's impossible." She was already calculating. Wind, left to right, approximately 6 knots at ground level, probably 8 to 10 at altitude. Target velocity, she estimated his pace at roughly 15 kilometers per hour, moving southwest. Range increase rate, the helicopter was moving northeast at cruise speed. She'd have maybe a 5-second window before the angle was completely wrong. She needed to calculate the shot she'd have in 3 seconds, not the shot she had now. She needed to put the bullet where he was going to be when the bullet arrived, accounting for his movement, the helicopter's movement, the wind at multiple altitudes, and the Coriolis effect over 870 plus meters. Her father's voice. She wasn't thinking about the math anymore. The math was done. The math lived somewhere below conscious thought. In 14 years of muscle memory and calculation and 10,000 rounds downrange, she was just the stillness. She breathed out. She pressed the trigger. For 3 seconds, Al-Masri kept moving. The helicopter kept banking. The city lights slid beneath them. Then he stumbled. 1 step, 2, and went down on the rooftop and didn't get up. Rivera stared at her. Around them, 3 Rangers who had seen what she'd done were completely silent. How far was... Rivera stopped, started again. How far was that? She was already looking away, scanning, making sure. Far enough, she said. Her radio crackled, Cross's voice from the other helicopter. He had been watching. Overwatch. A pause unlike any pause she'd heard from him before. Was that Al-Masri? Confirmed. Another pause. Longer. How far was that shot? She looked out the helicopter window at the city below, at the lights and the darkness, in the place where a man who had coordinated the deaths of many people had just stopped coordinating anything. Far enough, Sergeant Cross, she said. Far enough. The debrief was at 0800, in the same briefing room where Cross had made his joke about babysitters 16 hours earlier. The table was full this time. 2 colonels, a man in civilian clothes who didn't give his name and who was clearly CIA, Rivera, Cross, and Mara. A junior officer was taking notes. Coffee existed, but tasted like punishment. The civilian led most of the interrogation. That was the only word for it. He wanted everything. Each spotter's position described in detail. Each engagement reconstructed shot by shot. The sequence, the timing, the decision-making at each stage. He wanted to know about the figure in her building, about Al-Masri's movement pattern, about everything she'd observed in 58 hours of continuous surveillance. She gave it all to him. Chronological, precise. She'd been trained to debrief the way she'd been trained to shoot. No emotion, no editorializing, just accurate information delivered clearly. She went through the 58-hour surveillance in compressed but complete form. How she'd identified the first spotter on hour 12. How the network had revealed itself over the following days. The transmission patterns she'd observed. The fighter staging area she'd located. The kid on the second floor. When she reached the 9-minute sequence, the civilian stopped her. "Take me through it shot by shot," he said. "Every adjustment, every decision." She did. It took 20 minutes to describe 9 minutes of action, which was normal. The ratio of experience to language was always that lopsided. While she spoke, she watched Cross across the table. He was listening with his arms on the table and his hands still. The posture of a man who was not planning what to say next, but actually listening to what was being said. She thought that was probably new for him in this specific context. She didn't say so. When she reached the malfunction and the 8-second clearance, the civilian held up a hand. 8 seconds, he said. "You cleared a case failure in 8 seconds, in position, at night, under time pressure, with 4 targets remaining." "Yes." "What was your heart rate at that point?" "Approximately 68 beats per minute." A silence in the room that had a specific texture to it. "What's your resting heart rate?" the civilian asked. 52. He made a note. She watched him write it without expression. "Continue," he said. She continued. When she reached the 5th spotter, the bait sequence, the 3 wrong angle shots, the fractional exposure she'd created and exploited, Cross shifted in his seat. It was a small movement, barely visible, but she caught it. She didn't know what it meant. She thought it might mean that he was doing the calculation she'd done in the briefing room the night before, the one he hadn't quite been able to complete until now, when he had the full sequence in front of him. When she finished, the civilian closed his notebook. "The shot on Al-Masri," he said. "You had no authorization for that." "Correct." "The target was not in your assigned mission parameters." "Correct." "You were in a moving helicopter at approximately," he checked something, "870 meters confirmed range, increasing. Target was moving. Insufficient time for a proper firing solution." "I made it work." The civilian looked at her for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man who had spent a very long time observing people in difficult situations and had learned to discount most of what they said and pay attention to what they did. "The intelligence from Al-Masri's network," he said carefully. "Had we lost him, had he successfully extracted, we would have lost 18 months of work building a pattern on his operations. We believe his network was planning simultaneous strikes on 4 coalition positions within the next 30 days. Conservative estimate of casualties prevented by his elimination, significant." Nobody spoke. "His network is now disrupted. The courier chains are broken. The money flow stops." He paused. "The shot that killed him was also unauthorized, outside mission parameters, and technically a violation of the rules of engagement as written, because you were not cleared to engage targets of opportunity from an extraction vehicle." Another pause. "It also may have saved more lives than anything else that happened last night." The room was quiet. One of the colonels, a compact man named Whitfield, who had said almost nothing until now, leaned forward. Staff Sergeant Voss, your service record, most of it is not visible to me. I've been told this is normal for your particular assignment history. Yes, sir. The classified portions. Can you tell me anything about them? No, sir. Whitfield studied her. The SEAL liaison who was present at a certain operation in northeastern Iraq in 2015. He reached out this morning after he saw your name in the preliminary report. He says to tell you that the Coronado team still owes you a case. She didn't react, but something in her chest did something quiet. I don't know what that means, she said, which was not entirely true. Whitfield nodded. He had the expression of a man who had received an answer that was more informative than it appeared. Cross was waiting for her outside the briefing room when she came out. He was standing with his back against the wall, arms at his sides, not crossed, which she noticed. He looked like a man who had been rehearsing something and had decided at the last moment to abandon the rehearsal and just say the thing. She stopped in front of him. Cross, she said. Voss. He was quiet for a moment. The thing I said when you walked in yesterday. Which thing? The babysitter thing? She waited. It was. He stopped. Tried again. I've been doing this job for 14 years. I have a set of things I know to be true about how combat operations work. And one of those things was, I was wrong. He said it like it was a report, like he was stating a fact, not making an apology, which, she thought, was probably the most honest way he knew how to do it. I should not have said that in front of my team. No, she agreed. You shouldn't have. He reached into his chest pocket and produced something. She recognized it before she could see it clearly. The weight and shape were distinctive. A challenge coin, Ranger Regiment, but with something additional on the reverse side that she couldn't read at this angle. My team voted, he said. Unanimous. He held it out. She took it, turned it over. On the reverse was engraved, Asterisk Raqqa, 2017, 9 minutes. She held it for a long moment, felt the weight of it, the deliberateness of having something engraved. Who authorized the engraving? She asked. Kowalski. Kid's got a Dremel tool and too much time on his hands. Cross paused. He also asked me to tell you that he'd like to buy you a beer when we're back stateside, which I told him was presumptuous, but he's 22, so for the first time since she'd arrived at the Phobe, Mara Voss smiled. It was small and brief, and she kept it controlled, but it was real. 9 minutes, she said. 9 minutes, Cross said. He turned and walked away. She watched him go and noticed something she hadn't expected. His shoulders were different. He was carrying them differently than he had yesterday. Something had shifted in him. Not everything, probably not even most things, but something. She found Rivera in the medical tent, arguing with a nurse about being discharged. He had a pressure bandage on his left forearm, a fragment from the secondary device in the building, a piece of concrete that had caught him in the stairwell during their exfil. Minor wound. He'd completed the entire operation after it without mentioning it to her, which she only discovered at the extraction point when she noticed the blood on his sleeve. You're an idiot, she told him. I'm an efficient utilizer of medical resources, he said. I was using the blood inside my body to carry oxygen. I determined that sufficient quantities remained inside for continued operation. You lost a significant quantity outside of your body. Also noted. He looked at the bandage with the expression of someone who found his own injury mildly interesting. Will I still be able to spot? The nurse will determine that. I've already determined it. The answer is yes. I maintain this position despite medical opposition. He paused. Will you support me in this position? No. That's what I expected. He leaned back against the medical cot. Mara, that last shot. She sat down on the chair beside his cot. 870 meters, he said. Moving target, moving platform, fading light. He shook his head slowly. I've been your spotter for 14 months. I've seen you do things I didn't think were physically possible. That was the most impossible of all of them. It was a math problem. It was a miracle with trigonometry attached. She was quiet for a moment. The tent smelled like antiseptic and canvas and the specific neutrality of a place designed to fix bodies. Outside, she could hear the bass settling into its daytime rhythm. Rivera, she said, the 8th spotter, in our building. The kid, he was 18, maybe younger. She paused. Someone gave him a radio and a gun and a building to watch. He'd probably been doing it for weeks. He didn't know what he was watching for exactly. He'd never fought anyone. She paused again. I zip-tied him to a column. He was confirmed recovered, Rivera said quietly. I heard it in the post-mission brief. He's in custody. He'll be interrogated and probably released. A pause. He'll go home. She nodded, said nothing. Do you think about them? Rivera asked. The ones that don't? He stopped. Yes, she said. I think about all of them. Does it get easier? She thought about a gunnery sergeant she'd met once on a range at Camp Pendleton, older, 2 decades in the Marines, who had told her, asterisk, the weight is permanent. You just learn to carry it better. No, she said, you just get stronger. The formal debrief with the regimental commander happened at 1600. Colonel Whitfield sat at the head of the table, and what he said was not entirely unlike what Cross had said, but with 4 times the language and a formal document already drafted. Staff Sergeant Voss, your actions last night resulted in the elimination of 5 enemy observation elements, preventing the compromise of a Ranger assault element and the likely deaths of multiple American soldiers. Your unauthorized engagement of the target, al-Masri, resulted in the disruption of an enemy logistics network, with estimated strategic impact still being assessed. Your professionalism and skill under extreme conditions were exemplary. He set down the document. You will be recommended for the Silver Star. A pause. You will also receive a formal letter of reprimand for unauthorized engagement of a target of opportunity from an extraction vehicle in violation of standing rules of engagement. He looked at her directly. She met his eyes. Both will be placed in your service record. Both will follow you for the remainder of your career. He leaned back. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Do you have anything to say about either determination? She thought for a moment. About 9 minutes and 5 spotters, and a shot at 870 meters, and a kid zip-tied to a column, and the look on Cross's face when he handed her the coin. No, sir, she said. I understand the situation. Whitfield studied her. He had the look of a man who had expected more protest, more justification, more anything, and was recalibrating. You're either very disciplined or very at peace with contradictions, he said. Both, sir, she said. I think they're the same thing. The night before she flew out, she walked the perimeter of the base. It was a habit she'd had since her first deployment, walking the fence line after an operation, letting her legs carry her while her mind did the slower work of processing. The base was small and the perimeter was short, and she walked it 3 times before she stopped at a corner where she could see both the dark Syrian sky and the lights of the operation center. Specialist Kowalski found her there. She hadn't heard him coming, which told her something about his potential. Not many people could approach her position without her knowing. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He held one out. She took it. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the coffee." "You were going to walk into it anyway," she said. "The kill zone." "Yeah." He was quiet. Cross said, "Before the operation, after you'd made your pitch, he said to me, 'She might be right.' I asked him what happens if she's right and we go in anyway, and he didn't answer. He made the right call. In the end." Kowalski nodded. He was looking at the sky. He had the face of someone who had just seen something that permanently revised his understanding of what was possible. "How did you get that good?" he asked. She thought about an October morning in Stuttgart, about cold air and a father's patience, and a single sentence in German that she was still unpacking 18 years later. "I had a good teacher," she said. "Cross wants to be a good teacher," Kowalski said. "I think that's why he's the way he is. He has all this knowledge and he wants to pass it on, but he's got this one spot where he stopped. I don't know. He's working on it," she said. "Yeah," a pause. "The babysitter thing, I want you to know that I thought it was, I know," she said. "It's all right." "It's not, though." She looked at him. He was 22 years old with a Dremel tool and a challenge coin and the specific earnestness of a young soldier who had just survived something that rearranged his priorities. "No," she said. "It's not, but it's what happened and it's over. And what matters now is what you carry forward from it." She paused. "What will you carry forward from it?" He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which she respected. That the people who look least like what you expect are sometimes the people you should trust most, he said finally. She nodded. "That's a good start," she said. The flight home was long. She slept most of it. The deep blank sleep of someone whose nervous system had finished its emergency protocols and was now demanding payment in unconsciousness. She woke somewhere over the Atlantic with Rivera's shoulder against hers, and the cabin dark, and the engines doing their particular low-frequency hum that she had always found, for reasons she couldn't explain, calming. She thought about her father. She thought about the sentence he'd given her, the one about stillness and heartbeats, and she tried, as she had tried hundreds of times, to locate where exactly the stillness came from, whether it was something born in her or something he had placed there, whether there was a difference. She'd been trying to answer that question for 18 years, and she was no closer to an answer, which she'd decided was probably the point. Some questions were not for answering. They were for carrying, for turning over in your hands every so often the way you turned over a stone you'd picked up somewhere and couldn't quite bring yourself to set down. She thought about the malfunction, about those 8 seconds, about the way her hands had known exactly what to do while the rest of her had been managing the noise of knowing how much was at stake. She thought about the word her father had used, asterisk, stiller, asterisk, and she thought that maybe what he'd meant wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of something underneath the noise that noise couldn't touch. The part of you that had done the work and knew it and kept going anyway. She thought about the kid on the second floor with the radio and the handgun. She thought about the Rangers who had made it home because 5 spotters went down in 9 minutes. She thought about both things simultaneously, holding them together, refusing to resolve them. You couldn't resolve them. That was the thing nobody told you when you were young and learning to shoot on a cold range outside Stuttgart. The math always came out even. People saved, people lost. The numbers on either side of the equation real and heavy and permanent. You couldn't make the math resolve into something clean. You could only carry it and carry it and carry it and hope that the weight of it kept you honest. She thought about Cross, about the specific quality of his silence in the debrief that morning, the way he'd listened to her reconstruction of the 9 minutes without saying anything, without the posture of a man building a counter-argument, just listening. She thought that was probably new for him in this context, and that newness probably cost him something, and that the cost was the point. Change that didn't cost you anything wasn't really change. Rivera stirred beside her. He was half awake, the way he'd been half awake in the rubble for 58 hours, not fully conscious, but alert in the background, the part of his mind that never quite went all the way off. "You're thinking too loud," he said without opening his eyes. "Sorry." "Stop being sorry. You earned the thinking." He shifted slightly. "What are you thinking about?" She was quiet for a moment. Whether the stillness is something you're born with or something you build. He considered this. His eyes stayed closed. Why does it matter which one? Because if you're born with it, you can't teach it. You can only find it in people who already have it. And if you build it, then you can teach it to anyone who's willing to do the work. Rivera was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd gone back to sleep. Then, "My grandfather was a carpenter. He said the difference between a good carpenter and a bad one wasn't the tools, and it wasn't even the technique. It was how much silence they could work in." He paused. He said if you need to talk while you work, you're not really working. You're just visiting the work. She thought about that. "He sounds like my father," she said. "Different languages," Rivera said. "Same sentence." He went back to sleep. She stayed awake and watched the dark Atlantic slide beneath them and thought about silence and work and all the ways the same lesson arrived wearing different clothes. When they landed at Ramstein for the transfer, she had a layover of 4 hours. She found a quiet corner of the terminal and sat and wrote in her notebook. Not a debrief, not tactical notes, just words. She'd been doing it since her second deployment, filling notebooks with the kind of observations and questions that had nowhere else to go. Her father had done the same thing. She'd found his notebooks after he died. 12 of them, small and battered, filled with cramped German handwriting. She'd never been able to read most of them. Her German had been better when she was younger, but she'd held them, all 12, for a long time, running her thumb over the indentations the pen had left in the paper. She thought he pressed hard when he was working something out. The sentences that cost him the most were the deepest. She wrote for 2 hours. Then she closed the notebook, put it in her kit, and went to find coffee that was better than the fob version, but still not good. There was a moment, later, not at the ceremony, but afterward in the parking lot, which was where honest conversations had always happened because nobody was performing for an audience in a parking lot, when Kowalski caught up with her. He was still in his dress uniform. He had the look of someone who had written something down and then lost the paper. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "That first night, in the briefing room." He hesitated. "When Cross said what he said, you didn't react at all. How did you do that?" She considered the question. It was a good question, better than it appeared on the surface. "I've been called worse things," she said, "by better people. That's not what I mean. I mean, you heard it and you didn't do anything with it. You just went back to your notebook. I couldn't have done that. I would have said something. Saying something would have cost me credibility in that room, at that moment, with those specific men. I needed the credibility more than I needed to say something." She paused. "There's a time to push back and a time to let people watch you work. The time to push back is after they've watched you work and they can't argue with the results, not before." Kowalski was quiet for a moment, processing that. "But it's not fair," he said finally, "that you had to." "No," she said, It's not fair. She held his gaze. A lot of things aren't fair. You can spend your energy on the unfairness, or you can spend it on the work. Most days, I choose the work. She paused. Some days I'm angrier about it than others, that's honest. But in that briefing room, with 60 Rangers on the clock, I chose the work. He nodded slowly. He had the expression of someone for whom a thing had just become real in a way it hadn't been before. Not an idea, but an actual lesson that had actual weight. I'm going to remember that, he said. Good, she said. She shook his hand and walked to her car. In the rearview mirror, she saw him standing in the parking lot in his dress uniform, looking at nothing in particular, working something out. She hoped he got there. She thought he probably would. She was back at Fort Bragg for 6 weeks before the Silver Star ceremony. During those 6 weeks, she ran. She slept. She ate real food and failed to explain to her mother over the phone what Syria had been like, because there was no explanation that landed correctly. Every description either undersold it or became so specific that it stopped making sense to someone who hadn't been there. She said, "It was fine, it went well," and her mother said, "I worry about you." And she said, "I know," and neither of them said the thing underneath, which was asterisk. This is the life I chose, and I need you to trust that I chose it for real reasons. She drove 2 hours to visit Rivera at his family's home in Albuquerque. His mother fed her for 3 hours, and his little sister, 9 years old, fierce, with Rivera's dark eyes, demanded that she explain in detail what snipers ate for lunch, which Mara answered with absolute seriousness and which the sister found satisfying. Rivera walked her to her car when she left. "The arm," she said. "Good, fully functional. I could spot tomorrow if needed." "It won't be needed tomorrow." "I know." He leaned against the car. "How are you sleeping?" She considered the honest answer and gave it, "Better. Not good, better." "Me either." He was quiet. "That kid on the second floor. I keep thinking about him." "Me too." "Do you think he—" "I don't know," she said. "I hope so." Rivera nodded. He had the look of someone trying to locate the place where a weight went when you set it down, and finding that there was no such place. "You know what helps me?" he said. "I think about the 60 Rangers. I think about their names. I've been finding them out, looking them up. They have families. Most of them have kids. Some of them are young enough that the kids won't even remember the deployment. They'll just grow up with a father who came home." He paused. "That happened because of 9 minutes." She nodded. 9 minutes, she said. 9 minutes, he said. They stood for a moment in the Albuquerque evening, the air warm and dry, the sky going orange at the edges the way it did in the desert Southwest. Differently from Syria, the colors cleaner, the violence of the sunset purely aesthetic. "Can I tell you something?" Rivera said. "About the debrief?" "Yes. When you were going through the sequence, the 9 minutes, and you got to the malfunction, the CIA guy asked you what your heart rate was." He paused. "And you said 68, and he made a note. And then he asked your resting rate, and you said 52. "I remember." "Do you know what Cross did when you said that?" She hadn't been watching Cross at that moment. She'd been focused on the civilian and the notebook and the reconstruction. "No," she said. "He looked down at the table," Rivera said. "Not in a bad way, more like he was doing math. Like he was recalculating something he thought he already knew the answer to." Rivera was quiet for a moment. "I've been spotting for 14 months. I know what 68 beats per minute looks like on a person under that kind of pressure. I've never seen it before in a human being. I've seen it in you 3 times. He looked at her. "Cross didn't know that about you when he called you a babysitter. He knows it now." She looked at the sky. It doesn't undo what he said. No, Rivera agreed, but it means something that he's different now. People don't usually get different. He did. A pause. I think you did that. I didn't do anything except my job. Yeah, that's what I mean. She got in the car. She drove back to Bragg in the dark with the windows down and the highway empty and the stars visible above the North Carolina pines. She thought about 9 minutes and about 58 hours in a bombed-out building and about the word her father had used, asterisk, stilla, asterisk, stillness. And she thought that maybe it wasn't only about the space between heartbeats, the technical quieting of the body before a shot. Maybe it was about this too, the ability to sit with things unresolved, to hold the weight without needing to put it down, to keep moving forward while carrying everything you'd accumulated along the way, all the names and faces and choices and their consequences, and still find it possible to sit in a car on a dark highway and feel, not peace exactly, but something that lived next to peace, something she might call, on good days, enough. The Silver Star ceremony was held on a Tuesday, which struck her as appropriately mundane. Ceremonies, she had learned, were more powerful when they were unremarkable, when the location was ordinary and the coffee was mediocre and the parking was difficult, because it meant the thing being recognized was real and not theatrical. Colonel Whitfield pinned the medal to her dress uniform and read the citation in a voice that was formal and precise, and did not, to his credit, editorialize. Staff Sergeant Mara Voss distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous actions during a combat operation in support of Operation Inherent Resolve. Under extreme pressure and at great personal risk, Staff Sergeant Voss eliminated 5 enemy observation elements in 9 minutes, preventing the compromise of a Ranger assault element and preserving the lives of 60 American soldiers. Her subsequent neutralization of a high-value target at 870 meters from a moving platform demonstrated extraordinary skill and tactical judgment. Her actions reflect great credit upon herself and uphold the finest traditions of the United States Army. Applause, cameras, her parents in the third row, her mother crying in the quiet way she cried, her stepfather's hand on her mother's shoulder. Afterward, in the receiving line, a reporter from a military publication asked her the question she'd been expecting. Staff Sergeant, how does it feel to receive a Silver Star while also receiving a formal reprimand for the same action? She thought about what Whitfield had told her in Raqqa. Asterisk. Both will follow you for the rest of your career. It feels accurate, she said. The right decision and the wrong decision can sometimes be the same decision. The Silver Star is for what I did. The reprimand is for how I did it. Both are true. She paused. I'm at peace with contradictions. The reporter blinked. It was not the answer he'd been expecting, which was probably why it was the right one. Cross came to the ceremony. She hadn't expected that. He was back with the Rangers. No reason to be in North Carolina. She found him standing near the back, out of the way, in his dress uniform. You drove here, she said. Flew. Caught a hop. He looked uncomfortable in the way large, competent men sometimes looked at formal events, like the formality didn't know what to do with him. Kowalski wanted to come. I told him he'd have to wait until he's not on duty rotation. How is he? Good. He's good. He's going to be good. Cross was quiet for a moment, looking at the medal on her chest. I wanted to... He stopped. I've thought about what to say, and I haven't come up with anything that covers it. So I'll just say, I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and that won't happen again. She looked at him. Sergeant Cross, she said, I've been called worse things than babysitter by people with more rank than you. What made it matter is that you were in a position of authority over an operation that I was trying to help, and the bias compromised your judgment for approximately 12 hours. She paused. The 12 hours before you changed your mind. Right. So the lesson isn't about the word. The lesson is about the 12 hours. She held his gaze. Don't lose 12 hours again. He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said, I won't. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and deliberate, not a performance of firmness, just the actual thing. As he was leaving, he turned back. 9 minutes, he said. 9 minutes, she said. He walked away, and she watched him go, and thought about how the most important things often arrived packaged in the most unlikely people, about how the soldier who'd called her a babysitter had become, in the space of one operation, the man who'd flown to North Carolina in his dress uniform to say he was sorry. People were capable of that. The change, the shift. She'd seen it enough times to believe it was real. She thought about her father, who had also been capable of that kind of quiet revolution. The willingness to be wrong and then to simply be different, without ceremony, without announcement. He just changed, the way rivers change course, slowly, and then all at once, and then permanently. She was still becoming it, still finding out what it meant 18 years after he'd said it in the cold German air on a morning when she was 13 and impatient and pulling left at trigger break. Maybe you never finished becoming it. Maybe that was the point. The notebook she'd filled in Ramstein Terminal stayed in her kit for 3 months. She forgot it was there, or told herself she had. She'd become practiced at the art of strategic forgetting, the deliberate shelving of things until she was ready to look at them. It was a skill she'd learned from her father, who had been better at it than she was, and who had also been worse at it in ways she didn't understand until after he was gone. The notebooks he'd left behind were full of the things he'd shelved too long. She wondered sometimes if she was doing the same thing, or if she'd learned from watching him to open the drawer sooner. The night she found the notebook, she was cleaning her kit for an assignment she hadn't received yet, but could see coming. The Army had a particular rhythm to how it moved people, and she'd gotten good at reading it. She was sitting on the floor of her quarters at 2300, systematically going through each pocket and pouch, and she pulled out the notebook and sat there for a moment with it in her hands, feeling its weight. She read it for an hour. Most of it was what she expected. Observations about the mission, about Cross, about Rivera, about the spotters and their patterns, and the sequence she'd assembled and executed. Tactical notes written in the private shorthand she'd developed over years. Questions framed as half sentences that she'd been in the middle of thinking through when she put them on the page. But near the end, she'd written something she didn't remember writing. The handwriting was slightly different from the rest. Softer, less pressured. The handwriting of someone who was very tired and not quite fully in charge of the pen. A single line, asterisk. The stillness isn't the absence of everything. It's what's left when you've carried everything and kept moving anyway. She read it twice, then a third time. She thought, that's what he meant. Not the absence of noise, not the control of noise. What's left when you stop fighting the noise and just move through it. The thing underneath that doesn't change, regardless of what's happening on the surface. The thing that was there when she was 13 and pulling left, and there when the boat failed on a Syrian rooftop at 0200, and there in the helicopter looking down at the city. It wasn't something you were born with or built. It was something you found when you stopped trying to find it and just did the work. Her father had known this. He told her at 13, in a sentence she hadn't been able to unpack for 18 years. which was probably how long it was supposed to take. She closed the notebook. She put it on the shelf above her rack, where she could see it. She laced up her boots, checked her weapon, and went to work, which was the only answer she'd ever found that lasted. Asterisk. For every soldier who has ever carried weight, they didn't earn and kept moving anyway.